Kashmir Hill is a senior online editor for Forbes, where she writes about technology and privacy issues. She recently published her first book, Secret Money: Living on Bitcoin in the Real World, about her experiences living on Bitcoin for a week. So here's Kashmir.
Great. Thanks. I think it might be funny to talk about living on Bitcoin here because I got the sense, talking just to my driver coming from the airport, that a lot of people are already living on Bitcoin in New Hampshire in a significant way. So of the people in this room, who already owns Bitcoin? All right, and how many of you use it regularly, like daily or weekly? All right, okay. So usually when I'm talking to audiences, I'm talking to people who don't know that much about Bitcoin and think it's like very strange and weird that somebody would have lived on it for a week. So I'll try to kind of change around my talk to take that into account. But one thing I want to do is just set the stage for what it was like deciding last year to live on Bitcoin for a week. In Bitcoin, I feel like years are Dogecoin years. There's so much that has happened since last April, May, when I did this experiment. So at the time, Bitcoin had gone through that attention-getting phase where it went from $13 to, really don't like being on a stage, from $13 to $100, $200. And so a lot of journalists were writing about it, and they were really excited about jumping in and essentially speculating on Bitcoin and buying low and selling high. And there are a lot of articles about how do you get Bitcoin, meeting up with other Bitcoin people through localbitcoins.com and having these kind of shady dealings in Starbucks where they hand over cash and get Bitcoin. And it was kind of a very like superficial treatment of Bitcoin. And it was really mostly about the Bitcoin as a kind of penny stock or fun investment opportunity. And I wanted to get to know it better and in a deeper sense. And I really didn't know that much about it going into it. I knew it was used on Silk Road and kind of illicit marketplaces. And I was interested in it because I write a lot about privacy. And so I was interested in this currency that allowed you to make purchases online without having to reveal a lot about your identity. But it seemed like the best way to really fully understand it would just be to immerse myself in the Bitcoin world. So in late April, I got rid of my credit cards and my cash and put them aside in a drawer in my apartment and just started the day with 5 Bitcoin that I had purchased a couple of weeks before. I first tried to purchase them through Mt. Gox because that was like the most popular exchange. And so I went to Bank of America, like I got all of my information about Mt. Gox, went to Bank of America, tried to send my money to Mt. Gox's account, and Bank of America refused to do it. They're like, oh, this is not a valid account. And I went through it again and again and again. It just didn't work. And I didn't realize it, but Mt. Gox was about to be shut down in the US by the Department of Homeland Security for operating an unlicensed money transmission business. So I didn't realize it, but I could have gotten a scoop on that just because Bank of America was refusing to send my payment through. So instead, I wound up going with Coinbase, which then was like a little startup in San Francisco that started offering Bitcoin wallets. And you could buy kind of small amounts of Bitcoin through them. And they were actually just a few blocks from my office. And then I had no problem. The thing was, I kind of eradicated all of the privacy offerings around Bitcoin because I linked my Bank of America account to my Coinbase account. So it would be very clear to somebody who wanted to track back my spending who I was if they went to Coinbase, got the account information for Bank of America, and then they would know me. And so in terms of privacy and anonymity, I immediately kind of hit this roadblock where it seemed like it wasn't all that people had promised it to be if you use the kind of third-party options that are out there now for getting Bitcoin, as opposed to if I had met somebody through localbitcoins.com and just met up with them and handed them cash and they sent me Bitcoin without taking my photo or anything. So the first thing I thought about when I decided to live on Bitcoin was kind of my ability to survive the week. And so the major things were kind of food, shelter, and transportation. So food-wise, San Francisco actually has, San Francisco is, the heart of technology, supposedly, in the US, and I kind of thought there would be a lot of Bitcoin options for me. But it turned out at that point there were only two food places that took Bitcoin. There was a sushi restaurant called Sake Zone, which is around the corner from the Internet Archive. And the Internet Archive guys, Brewster Kahle, had basically kind of convinced Sake Zone to start taking Bitcoin because Internet Archive had started accepting Bitcoin and actually paying its employees like nominal amounts if they wanted of Bitcoin. And Brewster Kahle wanted to create a kind of infrastructure around it so that his employees could actually use it. So he got the sushi restaurant to take Bitcoin. And so that was lucky. So I could get sushi. And then there was a cupcake place run by a woman named Jennifer. And they had started taking Bitcoin the previous fall and gotten tons of media attention for it. They were in like BBC, The Globe, lots of US publications. They later told me it actually helped save their business, that they were kind of on the verge of bankruptcy and decided to take Bitcoin, and the publicity attracted so many customers that even though they didn't get tons and tons of Bitcoin, just the attention helped save them. So those are my two options, cupcakes or sushi. So I was a little afraid that I was either going to, I was going to be an unhealthy week, whether because I was just eating a lot of flour and sugar and cream, or because I was going to get mercury poisoning. The other problem is that these two places were pretty far away. The sushi restaurant was miles from me, kind of uphill. San Francisco is notoriously hilly, and it was uphill. And the cupcake place was a few miles from my home and a few miles from my office. And the problem was the second thing I ran into is that I didn't have transportation. The BART, which is a train in San Francisco, didn't take Bitcoin. There weren't taxis that took Bitcoin. So my only option on that first day was to walk. So I started off walking to work, and I was planning on swinging by the cupcake place to get coffee, which I really wanted, and like some kind of cupcake breakfast. But the place was closed. So I walked the rest of the way through the kind of shady part of San Francisco to get to my office. And by the time I got there, I was like really hungry, and I'm definitely addicted to coffee. And so I was already starting to feel the caffeine withdrawal. So the first morning living on Bitcoin was pretty rough. So in terms of what I was going to do for food, I'd started looking around online, and I figured, Bitcoin is the currency of the internet. There's surely like many options online in terms of places I can spend my Bitcoin. But one of the only places I came across was survivalfood.com, which had a lot of like high protein bars that would like last for a long time in the event of like some kind of zombie apocalypse, and some kind of food bucket, which just had a lot of like high calorie, high protein things in it. And it was surprisingly expensive. The food bucket was like $700. The protein bars were like $200. That would have been 2 Bitcoin at the time. And I was about to just bite the bullet and order them when my boyfriend spotted a press release from foodler.com, which is a kind of like seamless food delivery service. And they had just started accepting Bitcoin. And so that opened up any restaurant in San Francisco that was working with Foodler to me and my Bitcoin. So I put 1 Bitcoin into Foodler, and it kind of felt like cheating because I originally just wanted to work with merchants directly who were accepting Bitcoin. But I was literally worried about kind of not being able to eat for the week. So I did that, and I interviewed the CEO of Foodler, and he was just talking about how excited he was. He and his co-founders had come out of the technology scene, and they liked the idea of this techno currency, and they also liked that it saved them money, that it lowered their transaction fees. But since then, I went back to interview him when the book came out a year later, and Foodler didn't want to talk to me anymore. And they're not publicly commenting on the fact that they take Bitcoin anymore. And they didn't want to tell me why. So I'm not sure if that's just about, there's kind of a lot of fear around Bitcoin and the legal implications and the tax implications. So I don't know if it just got a little bit too difficult for them. But Foodler did definitely save me during that week, and it was how I ended up getting most of my food. Transportation-wise, I was not able to find any car service that would take Bitcoin. I went on to Reddit to ask for help and advice in terms of how to survive on Bitcoin, because there's a thriving community there and on Bitcoin Talk. And a few people said, "Oh, I'll rent you a bicycle." or I'll give you rides. But then when I followed up with them, they said, oh, actually I live in like Minnesota, but I really support what you're doing. And I ended up finding somebody in my community, a friend who rented me his bike for the week for 0.25 Bitcoin. And it wasn't like the best bike ever, like the brakes weren't very reliable, but I was able to get around, and it was a lot nicer than walking everywhere. And at 0.25 Bitcoin, I think he gave me a pretty good deal. It was like $30 or $35 at the time. Though later, with Bitcoin's ever shifting value, it was worth more at a later date. The other thing I had to worry about was where I lived. So I started my experiment at the end of April, and my rent came due May 5th. And so the whole week I was emailing my landlord, who was down in Brazil, and saying, hey, do you mind if I pay a week's rent in Bitcoin this month? That'd be okay. And I kept texting her and emailing her, and she was really busy on a work project. And she finally responded and just said, I don't know what Bitcoin is. I don't know what you're talking about. Just pay your rent a week late. But I felt that violated, again, the rules I had tried to set for the experiment. So I said, no, I really want to do this. Let me try to explain it to you. And this is a big problem I encountered when I was trying to live on Bitcoin, is explaining it to people. I think once you know about it and you think about it for a while, it makes sense. But when somebody first says, oh, it's this digital currency that some guy that we don't know of, we don't know who he is, invented 5 years ago, and it might be worth $100 now or $1,000 later, it just sounds like crazy talk. I might as well have asked her if I could pay her in Starbucks gift cards or tulips or something like that. So I ended up having to move out of my apartment just because I couldn't get her to accept Bitcoin. I actually sent her Bitcoin via Coinbase to her email account and just encouraged her to open a Coinbase account and accept it. And my Bitcoin disappeared, and then she wasn't responding to me, and so it was a little scary because it was running my Bitcoin reserves down. But she finally signed in just to send me the Bitcoin back. But there were two hostels in San Francisco that take Bitcoin. One near my office, but when I went to their kind of metal gated location in a not the best part of town, they didn't have any vacancy. There's another one that was in my neighborhood called 20 Mission, and it's run by Jared Kenna, who was an early Bitcoin entrepreneur, bought a bunch very early on. He'd fought in the Marines in Afghanistan and came back in 2008 during the recession, during the bank crisis, was very frustrated with what was happening in the country, heard about Bitcoin, and thought, oh, this is a nice solution to this, or a way to avoid this whole system. So started buying it and launched something called Trade Hill, which was a Bitcoin exchange that later shut down because they had problems getting banking. A lot of banks don't like working with Bitcoin companies just because the regulatory environment is still kind of gray. But he had this hacker hostel space that was really receptive to Bitcoin. He said, come on over, we can definitely make room for you. It's great, you'll love it. But when I got there, I discovered that 20 Mission was still very much under construction. There are a lot of rooms that had just construction equipment in them, the walls were half complete. There were dogs running around the hallway. The bathroom was, the toilets had stalls, but the showers were just a series of curtains. There were chickens on the roof. It was a very rustic place to find in the middle of San Francisco. But they did accept Bitcoin, and it gave me some place to live, so I was very grateful. But one really strange thing about the whole week of living on Bitcoin, on this futuristic technology, the money of the internet, was that it was making my life so hard, and it was really throwing me back. I was having to use a bike to get around. I was living in this not very futuristic space. So it was just kind of ironic to me that I was having to revert to the kind of things of the past in order to live on the money of the future. But it was nice. So I had my food taken care of, my shelter taken care of, transportation taken care of, and there were times when it was a very tough week, but I found that the Bitcoin community was so supportive. And so people were sending me emails. They were in the comments of my blog post. I was blogging it in real time every day. They were giving me advice, telling me what I could do. And then there was a grocery store in Haight-Ashbury that was started by a former Googler. And he was reading about how I couldn't find any food. And so he decided that week to start accepting Bitcoin at Buyer's Best Friend, his grocery store, just so I could go somewhere and buy groceries. And I felt badly, journalistically, that I was kind of taking advantage of the observer effect, that I was saying, there is no place to buy food. And this person said, okay, I'll make a place for you to buy food. But I really wanted to go and be able to buy groceries and be able to cook my own meals. So I went there and I met him, and he had this really interesting take on the Bitcoin community. I think he was partly taking it as many businesses do now for the publicity, and it is a great free way to get a lot of publicity, at least for now, while we're still in the early adopter phase. But to say, okay, we're going to be the first NBA team to take Bitcoin, or we're going to be the first retailer online to take Bitcoin, is an easy way to get tons of articles about you. But he also just liked the Bitcoin community and the kind of customers that he might get from it. He compared it to, he had this kind of artisanal organic market, and it appealed a lot to vegans. And he said, vegans are the best customers. They're really loyal. Once you have products that they like, they'll keep coming back. And he said, the Bitcoin community kind of reminds me of cypher vegans. These people that once if you're a retailer and you accept their product, you're willing to interact with them, they'll be very loyal to you and very supportive of you. And I thought that was a very interesting observation. I also had the Bitcoin community start giving me tips. I had made my wallet address public so that people could see my holdings and see as I was spending. And people started sending me tips. And sometimes I would have advice with the tips, and sometimes it would just be parts of Bitcoin. And it started coming in, it was 0.01 Bitcoin, and then 0.1, and sometimes a full Bitcoin. And by the end of the week, I'd received something like 10 to 12 Bitcoin, which at the time was $1,000+. And now, at various times that would have been like $10,000, $5,000, $6,000. And this was really troubling to me as a journalist, because I am not usually paid by people when I'm writing stories, unless they're the magazine or the news publication that has commissioned the story. And so I didn't really know what to do with all the Bitcoin tips that had come in. It would not be an option for me just to keep that. So what I decided to do instead was to use all the tips at the end of the week and take anybody who was invited from the community to Sake Zone, the sushi restaurant, so I could meet everybody from the community and basically get rid of this money. And so I put an announcement up about it in Reddit. I put it on the Bitcoin meetup, and people started RSVPing. And I thought maybe it would be 20, 30 people, but the RSVP started really rolling in, and soon it was 50, and then it was 60, and then it was 70. And the sushi restaurant is pretty small, and I was starting to get a little worried about us fitting. And I called them up and I said, hey, I think it was a Monday night. I said, I think I'm going to be renting out the whole restaurant. And they're like, oh, okay, that sounds great. And I said, and I want to be able to pay for the whole dinner in Bitcoin. And they're like, the whole thing. And I was like, yeah, is that okay? That's a lot of Bitcoin. Before that, they had been getting, maybe 0.2 Bitcoin at a time, 0.3 Bitcoin at a time. And they're like, sure, we can do that. And I said, I think it's going to be 60 or 70 people. And they're like, oh, our restaurant only holds 50 people. So I had all of these people show up, and it was this we did not really fit in there. We were kind of spilling outside of the restaurant. And it was very much the Bitcoin community has lots of different types. You have the people who got in the very early people who just love the kind of the technology behind Bitcoin and the code and that part of it. And then there were the people that were interested in it for kind of political, economic reasons, this idea of having a currency that is not controlled by a state, that's independent of that. And then people who got in for using it for illicit uses on Silk Road, where you could have a place where you could make payments and not have identifying details attached to them. And then there were increasingly in the last year the people who are getting into it because they just recognize it as a great investment opportunity, a way to make money. So the Silicon Valley has poured millions of dollars into Bitcoin startups, and there are a lot of people there who are starting to make little tiny Bitcoin startups. So it was really like chaotic and wonderful in this kind of like circus of people attracted to Bitcoin. There were some economists there from the Austrian school, and they were having this like great debate about whether Bitcoin is sustainable. And I ended up paying a little over 10 Bitcoin for that dinner, and it was a great way to get rid of my tips. But yeah, at this time, like a lot of people thought that Bitcoin might actually be. People were afraid that the U.S. government would declare Bitcoin illegal. That was like a real concern for all the people I was talking to. There had been guidance that had come from FinCEN, which is the kind of anti-money laundering, anti-financial crimes agency in the Department of Treasury, that offered some guidance and said that companies that were working and transmitting Bitcoin needed to be licensed with them. But other than that, people were really uncertain and scared. And that has changed, I think, so much, in part because of the hearings in November, the Senate hearings, where you had a lot of agencies who said they weren't that concerned about Bitcoin. It's not something that we have to get rid of. And that's really what sent the price soaring above $1,000 because it was reassuring to investors, especially a whole bunch of people in China. So that's something that's so different now than it was then, though it's certainly not the case in other countries. Soon after China got very, very interested in Bitcoin, the government there cracked down because they were worried about it allowing another currency that could undermine the RMB. And so they said, we don't want people using Bitcoin in the real world. Bitcoin should just be kind of a virtual coin, virtual points, and that's it. And that sent the price really down again. But yeah, in the years since then, there have been so many investments in the Bitcoin community and the Bitcoin infrastructure. And if nothing else, I just think Silicon Valley is going to do its best to make sure that Bitcoin succeeds, just because they have so much resting on it now. And helping to develop that infrastructure is going to be great for Bitcoin. One of my big takeaways from the week was just how kind of incredible it was that this economic meme has caught on and spread. It reminded me a lot of science fiction novels. Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, where this idea of an idea taking hold and spreading and going viral. And Bitcoin is still limited to a very small community of people, relatively, but it really does seem like something that has struck a nerve with people, that people get interested in, and that spreads. And I just think it's kind of incredible the way that Bitcoin has evolved in just a short 5 years. That to me is, it kind of transcends the math and science of it, and is a kind of magical sociological aspect of Bitcoin. One thing that was difficult about the week is that I needed a smartphone to do all the stuff that I was doing, because I needed to be able to go up and scan someone's QR code and send them Bitcoin so I could buy things. And I have a Verizon iPhone, and Verizon wasn't going to take Bitcoin for my bill. And I could have used some of these intermediaries where I give somebody Bitcoin and then they send cash to Verizon, but I basically just said I have to cheat on this. In order to be able to live on Bitcoin, I do need like internet connectivity in a mobile way. So that was one of my cheats of the week, and it is one of the difficult things about Bitcoin as a currency. There was a couple from Utah who decided to live on Bitcoin for 3 months after they got married last year, and at the end of their trip, they decided to go traveling on Bitcoin, and they went to Sweden and to Singapore. And the problem was, when they got to Sweden, they realized that they didn't have their phones didn't work on the networks there, and so all of a sudden they had like no way to spend their Bitcoin, and they would have been screwed. But KNC Miner, this mining company, one of the companies that makes the mining equipment that people can use to help support the Bitcoin infrastructure and make money, gave them an iPad that would work in Europe. And without that, it wouldn't have worked for them. So anyways, so that was my week of living on Bitcoin and some of the takeaways. I can keep talking, but if there are questions that people have or kind of parts of this that you want to talk about, I'd love to take questions and discuss. Do we, oh, sorry.
Do you think that most of the merchants that took the Bitcoin cash out right away or hold on to the Bitcoin?
Yeah, so most people do cash out right away. And I think that is partly it's like once you work with a company like Coinbase or BitPay, they do immediately just change it to cash for you. The Cupcake place was keeping their Bitcoin. But everyone else, and the Cupcake place actually in the Sake zone were keeping their Bitcoin, in part because they weren't getting that much of it, but they were the rarities. Almost everybody else, the buyer's best friend that started taking it, Foodler, they just didn't want to be exposed to the currency risk. And I mean, Bitcoin is really volatile, and it's one of the biggest things holding it back. You don't know whether, during the course of my week, it fluctuated from $145 to $90, which was a lot given like that I only had 5 Bitcoin. I had to buy more just to like make it through the week. But until Bitcoin gets more stable, most merchants are afraid to hold on to it. Overstock, for example, they started taking Bitcoin at the beginning of January. They've had $870,000 in sales, which is incredible, but they're not holding on to the Bitcoin. They're just changing it into cash right away. So until that kind of changes, I think and once that does change, then I think it'll be more stable. And so that's the problem, the kind of chicken and the egg.
I like your reference to Snow Crash. I remember when I first heard about the rise of Dogecoin, I was like, this is something straight out of science fiction. Mm-hmm. This is completely ridiculous. But I just want to know, after your experience, what do you think the prerequisites are for Bitcoin actually becoming a viable mainstream currency?
So more merchants taking it. I think merchants giving people discounts for paying in Bitcoin, so it saves them. Credit card companies charge, anywhere from like 1% to 3% on purchases, whereas with Bitcoin that is much lower. And so Overstock, for example, is going to start giving people who pay in Bitcoin a 1% cash back in the form of like $0 or whatever they call them. So if there were more merchants that basically rewarded people for paying in Bitcoin, the way that sometimes you get a discount for paying in cash in the store, I think that would help for it to catch on. I think there need to be less crises in Bitcoin. The malleability bug is very confusing to people. Bitcoin is already a confusing concept, and when you have things like that happening, people don't like the idea of their money being flawed. So I think as some of the it's still an early technology, but as those kinks get worked out, and then it's just a matter of people getting more familiar with it. They do these, I think the last survey I saw said that like 45% of people now know what Bitcoin is, and that will go a long way toward it becoming mainstream or becoming adopted more widely. It's just people knowing what it is and then kind of understanding what it is. I think a lot of people still think that Bitcoin are those, physical Cassius coins that people that kind of have as a novelty item, and they don't really understand this idea of it as one big public ledger. So one is just people understanding it, more acceptance, and then less volatility. And it's funny on the Neil Stephenson thing. So I heard that he met with a bunch of Bitcoin entrepreneurs, and one of them said, Neil, you should start your own cryptocurrency. He's like, oh, well, but what would I call it? And this guy said he should call it Snow Cash, which I thought was really funny. So maybe one day we'll have Snow Cash as one of the competing cryptocurrencies out there. Back here?
How has the adoption been in San Francisco since you did that? If you had to do it again, would you have an easier time?
So I am going to do it again. I was going to do it on the anniversary of the first time, and then I'll be able to answer your question with more certainty. I still don't think I would have a way to get around. I think there's one kind of taxi driver who has a Twitter account, and he says he accepts Bitcoin. But to my surprise, like Lyft, Uber, Sidecar, they haven't started accepting Bitcoin yet, which just seems odd given that they're on the forefront of technology, but they're not interested in this kind of futuristic currency. There aren't a ton of new places that take it now. There's another sushi restaurant. could make it to Sacramento. I could go to a Sacramento Kings game. I think it'll probably still be a challenge. And my big thing was I really want to be able to buy coffee with Bitcoin. And I can't believe that in San Francisco, of all places, I can't do that. There is now one coffee shop called Cup of Coffee that accepts Bitcoin, but they're out in Palo Alto, which is, if you're familiar with the San Francisco area, like an hour and a half drive from San Francisco. So I am going to try it, and we'll see how it goes. I think it should be easier, just based on what I can get online now. But I don't know if actually the infrastructure in San Francisco is robust. I did go to Berlin last fall, and I went to Kreuzberg. And I'd heard Kreuzberg was going to be like this incredible place where everybody takes Bitcoin. I thought the streets would be paved with Bitcoin, and even there, it wasn't exactly what it had been promised to be. Like there were a few restaurants that took it. It certainly was more developed in San Francisco, and that is shocking to me, given Silicon Valley's interest in Bitcoin. Back here.
So this is less of a question, more of a, my New Year's resolution this year is that everyone I know, my friends and family, they're going to get a birthday gift in Bitcoin this year. And that goes to the point of spreading this around to people, because when you try to explain it to someone, again, they look at you like you've got 3 heads, but once they have it in their phone, they want to know, how can I spend it? And they go on the internet and they start learning about it, and suddenly they become hooked as well.
Yeah, so Bitcoin enthusiasts, Roger Ver is famous for this. They call him Bitcoin Jesus because he's an evangelist for the currency. And he'll give $1 in Bitcoin to everybody he meets just so they can see it, have it. And that's part of why I lived on Bitcoin, because I really wanted to understand it. It was actually my brother-in-law's birthday during the course of the week, and he was turning 34. And so I gave him 0.34 Bitcoin. And when the price went up to 1,200, he was all of a sudden interested in the Bitcoin, but only for the sake of cashing it out. So it was a very good birthday present. But I was hoping he would be more interested in actually exploring it and using it. Up here?
What did you use for the transactions? What wallet did you use? Could you comment on that?
Yeah. So I had an iPhone at the time, or I still have an iPhone, and I was able to use the blockchain wallet. This was before blockchain got kicked out of the Apple Store. Apple is not a fan of Bitcoin apps that allow for the sending and receiving of Bitcoin. Part of it is because of there is a very, very robust regulatory environment around money transmission in the US, both on the federal level and on the state level. I think there are 47 states that have money transmission laws, so they've kind of not wanted to have to make sure that the people that are in the App Store are fully licensed. And then countries are hostile towards Bitcoin abroad, and so I think they just don't want to deal with that. So they banished the Coinbase app, when it allowed sending and receiving Bitcoin, and they just recently apparently wised up to the fact that blockchain still let you send and receive. So I was using blockchain at the time, yeah, I'm lucky because I still have it on my phone. It hasn't gotten pushed out. But yeah, everyone I would talk to in the Bitcoin community was kind of shh, be quiet about the fact that blockchain still works. So hopefully that'll come back. But yeah, if you're a Bitcoin lover, you have to get an Android. Are we finished? No more questions? Okay. Thank you for letting me talk about the week.